started.
It started.
Okay. I will now call the Urban Renewal meeting to order. We are at the first citizen and community group comment. I don't think I have any tonight, but I could be wrong. Is there any?
No.
Okay. Now the consent agenda will approve the July 14th, 2020 minutes. So if I could have a motion to do so.
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, I got a first and second. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Okay, meeting minutes pass. So agency business. We have a presentation for urban renewal basics from Matt Lorenzen to give you guys an idea of what you'll be dealing with in the next few years. And I'll let him take it away.
All right, thanks. And I assume you can still hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
And are you seeing the PowerPoint screen right now?
Yes.
Yep.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I know you guys have already had a long night, so I'll try and move quickly through this while still doing it justice. Appreciate your patience. I know that you're more tired than I am because I've only been with you the past hour or so. And hello to the new council members. I hope to meet you in person sooner than later. Okay, so we could theoretically jump right into the application that we have, but I feel like, especially for new council members, you kind of need a framework to begin with in order to kind of understand the application that we're looking at. So let's look at some basics. I hope you had a chance to read the staff report and maybe get into a couple of the attachments that I sent. If not, this should at least give you enough sort of cursory information to have some meaningful discussion tonight about the application. So one of my responsibilities as economic development manager is to oversee our urban renewal activity, and urban renewal is something that is allowed under Oregon statutes and allowed in many other states as well. It's a way for cities to focus on putting properties into higher and better uses and to bolster the tax base in an area that may be otherwise defined as blighted. Blight can be defined for urban renewal purposes, I suppose, different ways. In Oregon, specifically, blight is typically thought of as areas that are not only physically and visibly deteriorated, but also not seeing assessed tax value growth because they're either in poor condition or just the area in general in which they exist is suffering economically and is kind of undesirable or less desirable. It has more potential that it's not seeing. Downtown Estacada was designated as an urban renewal area in 2007, not necessarily because it was this terrible, undesirable place, but because it had untapped potential. And that's how Estacada is using urban renewal as a way to address blight and revitalize the area, increase property values, and encourage development and investment in the area. The area that we have to work with is shown in green and outlined in red sort of checks there on the map. That's the downtown D zone. So urban renewal, again, by Oregon statutes, has to meet some criteria. There has to be a defined area, which I just discussed. There has to be a formally adopted plan with clear goals and specific projects outlined in that plan. Just forming an urban renewal district does not effectively give you sort of like a free pass to do anything you want in the area. There are certain limitations, and those limitations are dictated by the plan. That plan was one of the attachments, and I encourage you to review it. It's not exactly light reading, but if you skip at least to the sections that address the projects that were envisioned in 2007, that may be helpful. They can be of different durations. Most commonly is 20 years, and ours is 20 years. 2027 is like creeping up on us. So our plan allows for a maximum indebtedness of $6.6 million. That number is derived through research at the outset of the plan. So in 2007, they looked at the taxable area, again shown in green, and its potential for assessed value growth and therefore tax base growth in that area. And they crunched some numbers and used some mathematics that I probably don't understand, and they're able to derive this maximum indebtedness. And it tells you how much debt you can take on and service over the over the lifespan of the urban renewal plan and still be able to pay it off through tax increment financing, which I'll get into in just a second. One final requirement is that an urban renewal district has to be overseen by an urban renewal agency board. And in Estacada's case, that's the same as the city council. In other jurisdictions, it could be a different body. So again, the funding for urban renewal is through tax increment financing. Kind of a technical term, but I feel like, and it does have some nuances, but in its simplest form, I feel like this graphic kind of helps to explain it. There's another graphic included in one of the articles that I gave you, and it's okay as well, but this does, I think, a pretty good job of showing you how this works. So in 2007, when the plan was adopted and the term began, the tax base in that green area was, they call it frozen. And so those revenues that come in on that frozen base still go to all the affected taxing jurisdictions. And so it's not just the city, it's other taxing districts that normally collect property taxes. So that would be the fire district, that would be the school district as well, although Oregon statutes require that the state pay the school district back for any money that they contribute towards urban renewal. So even though the district is affected, they get made whole by the state of Oregon for their contribution to urban renewal. Other more obscure taxing districts would be like the vector abatement district, like mosquito prevention, and others that are not coming to mind right now. But in Estacada, there's probably a list of about a dozen taxing districts that are affected by urban renewal. The way that they're affected is that each year when taxes grow, that incremental increase is what goes into the urban renewal fund. So they still get their revenue from the 2007 base every year, but the incremental increase goes toward urban renewal. So each year, urban renewal is accruing funds, and those funds can be used in cash for projects, or they can be used to service debt. The Broadway project is an example of a project that was done through debt. So the city was able to get a bond. I don't know what kind of bond, I'd have to ask Melanie or Denise, but at any rate, a bond, and use that debt to complete the approximately $1.9 million Broadway beautification project. So again, the projects that urban renewal takes on are meant to not only beautify, but also increase taxable values. So of course, building a street doesn't directly increase values, but by making the area more desirable and a better place to do business, it indirectly increases property values. Another example, more recent, would be the revitalization of the motorsports building. This was a pretty atypical project as urban renewal goes. Typically, a project in urban renewal would come similar to the project that we're looking at tonight, where a private developer is saying, hey, I would like to do this project, but it doesn't really pencil because this area is somewhat economically depressed. And so I need some financial help in order to make this project make sense for me. Otherwise, it's in the red and I'm not doing it. With the motorsports building, we tried to partner with the private owners of the building, but they didn't really have the desire to get involved with it. And so we looked for a seller who might want to, a buyer who might want to buy the building and partner with us. And we came up empty-handed there as well. But the city council, in my opinion, in its wisdom, said we can't let an opportunity to create 2 new businesses in downtown slip by. So they authorized me and the Urban Renewal Agency to buy the building and take on the renovation ourselves, which is, again, fairly unusual. So currently we own this building. It was meant that we would sell the building to one of the tenants by this time, but unfortunately, because of COVID and the difficulty that that's placed on the businesses in the building, they're not quite ready to apply for commercial financing and buy us out of the building. But as economic conditions improve in the next year, we do anticipate that Yo Treats will be buying the building from us and will be receiving back a good chunk of the money that we invested into that building. There will still be a net contribution for Urban Renewal. Don't know that final number yet, but it will be somewhere between probably $75,000 and $100,000. This is another project that you might be familiar with, the dance studio there on Broadway. I'll just keep moving. And then the most recent project I believe we've done in partnership with a private owner is this little building on Zobrist, which is now the new home of Clackamas River Outfitters. Unfortunately, I didn't have a photo yet of with their sign up and their fleet out there ready to be rented, but I'm sure you saw it this summer. Okay, getting more relevant to the application we're going to look at here in a second. We do most of our work in urban renewal through our grant programs that we've created over the lifetime of the Urban Renewal District. So formerly, we had 4 different programs that were created. I won't get into the weeds on all those for out of the respect of your time, but suffice it to say that we now have consolidated those programs into 2 I will say more simple programs. Everything that was eligible for a grant under the former programs is still eligible under the new programs, but instead of separating the grants by what they fund, we have set them up to fund by project cost and size. And again, we could go into the weeds of why we set it up that way, but the short version is that we really would like to encourage more comprehensive large projects, and while still being able to fund some of the smaller cost projects that still deserve our attention. So there's a bit of a missing middle here, and that's intentional. We want to fund smaller stuff for businesses that just want to make some incremental improvements. We're probably going to let go some of the more medium-sized projects, and the reason why we're doing that is because we'd like to focus on high-impact projects with the funds we have remaining in urban renewal. So again, there's some additional reading for you if you're interested. The one that we'll reference tonight will be this 2019 finance plan. We'll need to take a look at that in order to inform our discussion of the application we have. Just something that we'll go back to and remember when we look at the application is that right now our grant programs are in that finance plan supposed to be funded at about $120,000 per year. Into the future up until 2027, the last year of the program. That will probably need to change if you have interest in the application that you're looking at tonight. You see where we're at with our maximum indebtedness there. We began with 6.6. We have currently used just over 3 million with about 3.4 remaining. That's also important to remember when thinking about some of the other approved major projects that we have in the plan, including the enhancement of the Lakeshore Trail, the beautification of Main Street, which is intended to be similar to Broadway, but not quite at the level of what was done on Broadway. And then finally, some sort of high impact public-private development project. So Main Street and Lakeshore would be public improvements with a less direct value on the tax base. We'd really like to see a public-private development project that would add to the tax base, because ultimately, this is what we're trying to achieve with urban renewal, so that those taxing agencies, including the city, who have foregone a certain portion of their revenue for the 20-year period, when their tax revenue gets turned back on, it's going to be way higher than it would have otherwise been had the urban renewal district not been doing its work and bolstering and building up the tax base in that area. So that's urban renewal basics. We can jump right into the application, but do you have questions for me right now, just as far as the sort of basic mechanics of urban renewal generally and how we're using it in Estacada?
Any questions for Matt regarding urban renewal? Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Sorry. Did you say that we're going to get rid of that middle grant? So we've got the small one that goes up to 10,000, and then we've got the other one that's minimum 50,000. And you said that we're probably going to be doing away with the middle?
We don't have a middle right now.
Okay.
We have the small program and the large program, but again, that was by design. It's not that the middle projects are not worthy projects necessarily. It's that we have to use the money intelligently. $6.6 million was a lot more in 2007 than it is in 2021. So we determined when we consolidated the programs to kind of cut out the medium projects, and that was a sacrifice made in order to still get the little projects and reserve funds for the bigger high impact projects.
Do you still believe that 10,000 is an appropriate cap for the lower projects?
I think it's an appropriate cap on grant amount, but I don't hold that belief rigidly. So, if you all feel like that's not an appropriate number anymore, then it's definitely subject to adjustment. But if you consider that it's a 50-50 grant program, that means it could do a project up to $20,000. Granted, $20,000 gets spent pretty quick when you're doing commercial construction, but if you're wise about it, I still feel like you can do a pretty decent amount with 20 grand. But yeah, it's subject to adjustment.
See, and I wonder too, if for a construction grant, if a $50,000 project where we can contribute 25 of that, I wonder if that might be considered a more appropriate number for construction grants on the minor scale.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Would a $50,000 construction project be considered appropriate for you when you consider a small construction project in a restaurant? $50,000 could probably be spent pretty quickly in construction.
Sure, any type of commercial project, 50 grand goes pretty quickly. But our large grant begins at a $50,000 project. So if someone had a $50,000 project,
which would then be 100,000.
It could be 100,000, but if they brought us a project that was $50,000, we could fund up to 25,000 of it under the large program.
That's what I'm saying, is I'm wondering if maybe we should consider raising the small grant program from 10,000 to 25,000 so that we can contribute to some, what I still consider small scale projects that would make a big impact on the tax increment value. But I think maybe that's a conversation we need to have at a different time.
Yeah, potentially, I think so. And that discussion would be informed by some of the discussion we're about to have when we look at the finance plan a little bit more closely.
Okay, great. Joel, you had a question?
I'm not getting audio from
I'm not getting you, Joel. Are you on there? Yep. He's having technical difficulties, so we'll get back to him here in a minute. Any other questions for Matt? No? All right, Matt, why don't you just go right into the grant process that we're going to be talking about tonight?
Sure. Just one second while I kind of transition over here. Okay, hopefully you can see the agenda now.
Yep.
Okay, great. So let's quickly look at the finance plan. This is a lot of numbers on a small screen, but the part that is kind of particular interest tonight is this area where it takes a look at grants. So the numbers here, 120,000 per year, 100 for various capital grants, and then miscellaneous grants for 20 grand. Those numbers were picked somewhat arbitrarily, but at the same time not. We kind of backed into those numbers after looking at other major projects that the urban renewal plan calls for. So those would be specifically lakeshore improvements. It's anticipated that 300,000 will be contributed towards that, as well as $2 million toward the beautification of Main Street. And then you kind of look at what's left over, and that's where that's kind of how we backed into the $120,000 per year. It's totally subject to adjustment, but it all has to add up at the end.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably all we need to go into as far as the finance plan goes for tonight. Yeah. So what we have before us is a proposal from a private property owner and a developer. Some of you may know Heath Stallcup. He owns a company called Heritage Properties and Investments. They do work around the state, I think, with some focus on the Bend area historically. But Estacada is home, and Heath has expressed an interest in doing development work at home where he feels like it can make an impact for the city that he loves. So our grant programs have these 9 goals. In order to fund a project, it does not have to meet all 9 of these goals, but obviously the more of these goals it hits, the stronger an application it is, and the more interested we ought to be in it. Heath Heritage Properties, the applicant, is looking to raise the building at 344 Southeast Main Street. This is the building that was at one time Lentz Auto Parts, was going to be Chicks on Main, and I think never quite made it, and now is sat vacant for a number of years and exchanged ownership a number of times, to Paul's dismay. So he's been the lucky neighbor as this property has kind of sat and languished over the recent past. So they're proposing to demolish it and redevelop the property as a 7,700 square foot, 2-story mixed use building. It would include 6 2-bedroom apartments, at least conceptually, and an 1,800 square foot commercial space for lease. They do not yet have a tenant in mind for the street level space. That application and the supporting materials follow. It's a pretty light application, but that was not because Heath didn't do a good job. It was because I encouraged Heath to just submit something in order to have this conversation and sort of get things started. It's not intended that a final decision will be made tonight, but rather we'll get some guidance on how we move forward with this application. Again, we've been talking with the applicant for probably close to about the past 24 months as he's considered doing this project and looked at where a good use of his limited funds would be. And this is the concept he's come up with and brought to us. So as we look at this project, we do it in the context of the finance plan generally, and also in the context of those grant line items that we were talking about. They're right now set at $120,000 a year, but if this project alone takes 6 figures, then some adjustment may need to be made. So I'll just kind of spin through my comments and the items that we need to discuss here. As far as urban renewal projects go, this is a pretty ideal project because it does meet basically all of these except for maybe preserving historic architecture. He's taken a careful look at that building and determined it's not particularly historic and not particularly salvageable either. It's kind of a Frankenstein building and probably just needs to be taken down and start fresh. So it's a strong application and has good potential to build the tax base, which is, again, what we're really after with urban renewal. In a final application, we'd like to see the applicant flesh out just how this project meets our goals, but for now, we've got what we need. For context, financially, in this year's budgeted fund for the large grant program, there's $45,000 remaining. You may remember this same body made a $30,000 contribution toward the enhancement of the subway plaza. So that's where it was originally 75,000 in the fund this year, and we're down to 45. There's also a little bit remaining in the small grant program, but I don't have that number exactly for you right now. So as I mentioned earlier, if funded, this project is going to consume all or potentially exceed a full year's worth of grant funding. So I don't think that that necessarily means you should rule it out. It just means that you need to think about the trade-offs. If you fund this to the tune of, I'll just throw out a number and say $150,000, that means that either each year up until 2027, you're going to have to reduce the amount of grant money available, or you could say in the year 2027, you're not going to have a grant program and you'll just wind it down in 2026. Or you could do a combination of those two things. There's different options. We could phase the grant across several years. Maybe they would get some grant money up front to demolish the building, and then an additional amount during construction and an additional amount after they complete the project and have a certificate of occupancy. There's kind of some different options, and those are ones that you'll have to weigh and make decisions on. I did note in the application that so far they only have one bidding contractor. They will need at least an additional bid, potentially two, depending on what you all feel is appropriate before we would approve anything. The bidding contractor that they have included here is a company called Heritage Construction. I don't believe that Heath Stalcup, the applicant, is any portion of the ownership of Heritage Construction, but I do believe there's a familial connection between the two. So if they do decide to go with Heritage Construction, we just need to have a lot of sunlight on that connection and make sure it's very well understood where grant funds are going, and making sure that it's not gonna, be some sort of conflict of interest situation. I don't suspect in any way that anyone is trying to play the city here, but we just want lots of sunlight on that so that no accusation in the future could ever be made that funds were misused. Let's see here. The project, of course, will need to meet design standards that we have downtown. And so to what degree you want to have input is another thing that you would probably want to discuss early on in this process. If you're going to be contributing a large amount of money towards it, one of the requirements on the applicant may be that you all or the Downtown Estacada Commission or some other body is the one that gives sort of a final blessing to the design. It doesn't have to be that way. Again, they have to meet standards. That's non-negotiable. But you could have 7 different designs that all meet the design standards. And which one do you feel is the best fit for Estacada? Which one is the best fit for that location? That's what you all might want to weigh in on. We'd also want to see a lot more detail in the form of a project pro forma in order to see why the applicant is asking for the amount of money they're asking for. They should be able to take a spreadsheet and lay out all of the revenues and all the expenses associated with not only building, but then operating this building as a revenue generating business entity into the near and even medium term future. I'm suggesting 10 years, but maybe beyond is appropriate, maybe less is appropriate. That's kind of up to you, but we really need some insight into why the applicant feels like this amount of money that they're requesting is appropriate in order to make it pencil. I would suggest that you entertain any amount up to what is needed to make it pencil, but to not contribute more than is necessary. I guess that's all I'm getting at there. And I think I've already covered that point. So tonight, and before you can all go to sleep, I see Charity's hitting the coffee. We need to kind of cover these 7 questions or areas of discussion. And so I'll leave it up to you, I guess, Mr. Mayor, to spend as much time as you feel is appropriate on these, and I'll stop talking. Sorry, I've tried to be concise, but these are kind of some areas where we need guidance tonight.
Okay, well, so the first one, go ahead and read it off to me. What exactly?
Is the Urban Renewal Agency sufficiently interested in this project? That's kind of question number 1. A mixed-use building in place of the existing building that would add residential units and new commercial lease space downtown. Yeah,
and I would say to myself that anything that's going to add to that downtown with a mixed use is very, very entertaining to me. I think it's something that we should look at, but obviously the council needs to weigh in on this. So I can't see the council from my screen, but you probably can on yours. You see anybody that wishes to speak on it?
Yeah, Katie's got a hand raised, and Jerry. Sorry, I don't know.
We stopped sharing the screen.
Yeah, sorry, I'll do that.
Okay, there we go. All right, Katie, you had something?
Yes, I have several. So first of all, housing, yay. It would have been really cool had we passed a construction excise tax and had another fund available that we could actually contribute funds to this project using a different revenue other than the Urban Renewal Agency. But here we are at the Urban Renewal Agency, so let's talk about it. Out of curiosity, has this applicant looked into other grants or other tax incentives that they may have for it being a mixed-use development? Not only a mixed-use development, but also more vertical development than we have in the rest of our city. In addition to that, because we have employers in the area who have employees that might be looking for housing, have we asked them if they're willing to contribute to any of this project? And that being said, if we are eligible for any additional tax incentives or grant programs because of the nature of this project, if we are able to match those dollars, what are those dollars matched going to require? I guess those are my questions. And I'm very excited.
Okay, Matt?
Oh, so I'll have to dig into those. Sorry, I didn't realize you were waiting for a response.
I know, lots of questions. We'll write them down because I wasn't really expecting answers today. Obviously, I'm very excited about this project. I've been thinking about a project like this in Estacada for a number of years. Some of the tax credits or grant programs available that I'm aware of are things like employer-assisted housing. We have new market tax credits, which actually provides a 39% tax liability reduction for investors and increases the equity of the developer. But it requires 20% of that space to be commercial. So that's one of the things. Density bonuses and vertical tax credits are another thing that other cities in the state of Oregon have been using. And that being said, if we're looking at 6 units that are 2 bedrooms, what I imagine with a commercial space on the bottom is probably 4 stories. Is that what we're thinking?
I think actually he's anticipating a 2-story structure. So it'd be four apartments on the 2nd story, 2 at ground level but facing the alley, and then a commercial space facing Main Street.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, if he was willing to work with on some sort of modification in the design potentially, if we were looking at any buildings that went above our existing density, or if you get what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that a project of this magnitude could be eligible for a lot of grant programs or other tax credits. And if that's going to be the case, a lot of grant programs and tax credits require some sort of a matching of funds. And if we as a city knew what that matching of funds was in order to receive additional grants or additional tax credits, I would be really excited to know what those numbers are, because I think that's going to give us a better idea as to what we can contribute to a project of this magnitude.
Yeah, I can definitely look into that. I don't have great answers for you tonight. We don't have a vertical housing tax credit established in Estacada right now, but that's something that I've been trying to get to among a host of other things. Whether or not we could get it established in time to impact this project, I'm not sure. Density bonuses is not something we currently have in our code, but could be adopted, and that could be a way for the city versus urban renewal, two different entities, to contribute, either through an SDC reduction or something of that nature. I don't know much about or anything at all about employer assisted housing. I will look into that.
I hesitate to go straight to SDC reductions or waivers, only because we ultimately use those SDCs in the future for capital projects, which we're ultimately going to need to rely on when we see an increase in people. We're going to have to invest in our capital infrastructure for water, sewer, garbage, all of that when we experience an influx in people. So I always hate to go straight to the SDC reductions or waivers, but if there are other sorts of incentives that we can provide to people, I would be very interested in having that conversation.
Okay,
So,
sounds good. I guess I've just never heard of density bonuses. Usually those come in the form of fee reductions.
okay. Yeah. Let's look into them. Sounds exciting.
Looks like Joel
there's also things like supportive housing that I'd love to
Jerry's
look into.
got hand up
I think
too,
Jerry's
so-
first.
Yeah.
Joel, go ahead.
I think Jerry's first, I think.
Okay, Jerry, go ahead.
Well, I don't have anything as grand as what Katie said, but as a 25 plus year resident of Estacada, I'm super excited to see that building get torn down and something raised that is worthy of our town. And knowing Heath the way I do, I think this project is going to be a good one on the up and up. And I'm excited for the, as Katie is, the multifamily residential housing. So thank you guys.
Before we jump over to Joel, I want to make sure I mention something that Katie brought up. When you start going up in height, I'm all for density, believe me. But we run into a couple issues. One of them is parking. That's part of the reason why the applicant has stopped at 6 units, is because we have parking requirements. I wish that our parking were a 0 minimum downtown, but I don't make that decision. But there are parking minimums. And so therefore, his lot is only so big, and that's why he's had to stop at 6 units. Additionally, when you start going up with any sort of development, I'm not an expert by any means, so I don't want to pretend that I am, but I believe when you get to 3 stories, you, in some cases, need to start looking at an elevator shaft, and that blows a project almost instantly. So you have to start going really tall in order to justify something like the cost of an elevator in order to meet ADA requirements. Again, not an expert on that, but I know it's something that frequently is a huge factor in a go, no go decision on a project, is whether or not building codes are going to require an elevator or not.
Okay.
But
Joel?
So one of the questions I had, you kind of touched on, was the parking, and because you got to think about the amount of vehicles that are going to be there for 6 units, which is about 12 vehicles, assuming max for 2 per household if they have that, plus parking for the store. So one thing I was wondering if we could look at it, if it comes out of the money, and I have a lot to learn on how this project works, but maybe making a change to that side of the street there that might allow for some parking to be put onto the street that would assist him to his property, give more leadway for parking to it rather than building on his property. If that's an option on there. Plus, it'd probably help some of the local businesses like Paul, having to, I've had to park in front of Paul's place, and It's sorry, Councilor Schobel, maybe professional about it. I've had to park in front of his place, and I park my truck sideways, and that takes up some odd places because I can't park at an angle there or something because there's no lines. Is there some way that we can look at that as well as an assistance to him getting this building reconstructed and assisting him to having more space to build on and maybe even if we can remove some of the parking spaces he has to have there, maybe he can add an additional unit or something.
Yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I will say that the current concept that he's working with right now already takes advantage of parking reductions that are offered already in the code. So because he's close to the TriMet bus stop, and because he's downtown, he gets a 10% reduction, I believe, for the bus stop and a 20% reduction for being downtown. So he's already at a 30% reduction of what the parking standards would otherwise require. Again, my feeling is that there's so much sharing of parking and visitation to different businesses when you come downtown. I mean, if I had my wishes, it would be that we had a 0 parking minimum on Main Street, just like we have on Broadway, but that's not the case. And so they've landed where they've landed in order to accommodate the required number of spaces.
My question isn't necessarily about the minimum spaces, is what can we do as a city? Can we allow him to maybe change the facet of the street there slightly to add spaces and like angled parking onto that street there that would, like I said, not only benefit him, but also maybe like Councilor Strobel's business as well, or even other people visiting that area, some of the other businesses that are across the street and things. So can we assist with him by putting some grant money in to adjusting the street, and that gets some more space on the property, like I said, to maybe even add another unit or something by redesign. If you see where I'm kind of going with that one.
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying now. Denise, were you wanting to jump in there or no?
Well, just Joel, there's off street. The requirements are for off street parking.
Right.
So those would not be off street parking because those would be in the public right of way. And we've also reduced our code to make it so there is a less requirement. It used to be 2 per apartment. Now it's just 1, right, Matt?
Right, that's correct. Yeah.
So we have looked at that, the council realizing that we needed to reduce that to encourage more. So even though we had more on-street parking, it doesn't change his requirements for his off-street parking.
Can we give him a variance that would allow him to account for those being on-street as counted as far as off-street parking, being the fact that it's going to be a mixed-use building and a downtown area?
Yeah, you can apply for a variance, but it can't be self-imposed.
Okay.
So he's,
I'm just trying to think of options that we can do to make the best use of that area.
We can talk to him about those too.
Because like I said, also it wouldn't just benefit the property itself, but also some of the other businesses around that area too.
Well, and so I mean, I like where you're headed with that, and in my mind, the way to make that maybe a more meaningful conversation is to look at how Main Street, when it's beautified as one of our upcoming urban renewal projects, how can we maximize the public right-of-way in order to add more parking spaces? Maybe they become angled on Main Street instead of parallel parking, and that would certainly add to the number of spaces on Main Street.
Yeah, we'll have to look at the width of Main Street because we already have the plan in place, but
Gotcha.
and it includes bike lanes and all that. So we'll have to look at the width. Yeah.
Okay, but okay, so do we have some consensus that there's at least enough interest to continue discussing this application? It sounds like yes. But,
Yes, I think so.
okay.
And I just want to throw it out there one last time. Some of the best ways to spend government money is as leverage for other money. If there are other programs or funds out there available for this project that just require us to match the dollars, I think that would be the best use of these grant dollars from the Urban Renewal Agency. And I would love to see that presented to us before the next time we see this.
Sure, I will do my best to research how we might be able to get our contribution matched, or leveraged, as you put it.
Thank you so much, Matt. That would be awesome.
Very good.
Okay, so moving to number 2, is there a particular strategy or strategies that you'd like to focus on in order to financially accommodate this? So let's just work with the hypothetical grant amount of 150,000. How would you like to see that absorbed into the remaining years of our urban renewal plan? Would you like to reduce the funding that's allocated for grants every year, or would you rather cut off a year at the end? We're not making any final decisions tonight, but as we go and look at adjusting the finance plan, it would be good to have your input there. Just conceptually, what would you like to see maybe happen?
Jerry?
Does it have to be a year at the end, or can we like decide like in the middle if there's no grant applications? We can say we're going to cut this year out, or does it have to be a year at the end?
Yeah, so in my staff report, I definitely said that suspending programs like next year or the year after is a possibility as well. Like, not at the end, but cutting off funding like in the middle, sometime between now and 2027. The only reason why I see that as maybe a less desirable option is that if a great project shows up next year and we've suspended our programs, we're kind of handcuffed at that point, or at least it becomes more complicated to unwind that. So it feels, in my mind, better to just cut off a year at the end rather than say next year there's not going to be any grant funding available.
And we have had years where we have not had any applications. So let's say we cut off the year at the end. So we fund this and next year still fund the 120, but the 120 doesn't get used up because no one applies for anything. Then you're adding it back to the end. So I think if you cut off from the end, you might still end up funding till the end, just depending on what happens.
Joel?
I think you kind of started touching on my question there is, so do we have to decide now when that money will be cut out, or can we say, yes, we know it has to be cut out at some point in the future, decide to progress forward, and then give it a analysis based upon the year that's coming? Okay, it's been a hard year. Less likely is going to be a grant request this year. Let's try to cut it out this year. Is that something we can do, or is that something we have to set in stone what year is now, and then we can change it in the future?
I mean, I think you could change it on the fly, but my recommendation, I guess, would be to, when you make a final approval of this, also approve how those funds are going to be absorbed, knowing that, yeah, everything is subject to amendment if there's an appropriate reason to go that route.
Okay.
Okay. Katie?
I believe in delivering good news instead of bad news. As someone who has to deliver bad news all the time, I usually set people up for disappointment up here so that if everything goes wrong, I can then say, hey, good news, I was able to get you back into your home earlier than I told you you would be, versus saying, hey, I'll get you in at 2:00, but then really have to call them at 2:00 and say, I'm so sorry, I won't be able to get you in at 2:00. Let's get you in at, we'll get you in at 5 or whatever it is now. So that being said, if we said, hey, you guys, in 2027, we won't have money for this, but then we get to 2027 and we do have money for it, I'd rather say, yay, as a city, we're so happy we're going to be able to deliver these extra funds to you, versus if we said we're going to absorb it in this way and that way and the other way, but then we get to 2027 and it didn't pan out that way and we go, oops, there goes the money. I'd rather just say that we take it off the end and be pleasantly surprised than to be disappointed. So
Good point.
I like that approach. So we can work with that as we continue to look at how this project fits in, is to maybe cut off the last year or last 2 years, depending on how the math works out, knowing that there's a possibility we may be able to fund those after all. We'll just have to see. So it sounds like I got good guidance there, but the other thing that I want to better understand as well is, like, with this grant specifically, should we look at trying to do a phased disbursement? So shall we help with this? The example I gave was, can we help with demolition and then help with construction and then help them on the back end after certificate of occupancy? Or would you rather just say, no, we want to see this done all the way to completion with a certificate in hand before we're going to contribute to it. I mean, we would commit to a contribution in writing up front that says, if you get a certificate of occupancy, we owe you this money. But it doesn't have to be that way. You could help along the way if that's what's needed. The applicant specifically was asking for a contribution towards demolition. Are you interested in that, or would you rather withhold funding until he's actually got a new building erected?
I personally would like to wait until the building is finished. I've been down this road before with you know, pay a little up front and do this, and then it ends up not being what I anticipated. I mean, that's a touchy ground, but I'm only one. Katie, you want to chime in on that?
I wholeheartedly agree. I would like to see us investing in a completed project, and it would be really disappointing if we as a council decided to invest in a project that ends up never being completed.
Yeah,
It's
I gotta
happened.
agree with you guys on that one too.
I'm on board with that too.
I agree with that as well.
Okay. I can deliver that news. It won't be great news to the applicant, but I think that's definitely the safest way to go. There is
Here.
some value. There is some
Hold on,
value, I
let's
think.
let Jerry chime in real quick.
Okay, yeah.
Is it
Jerry.
referring to this last thing we were talking about?
Yeah. So just knowing Heath, you know, on a personal level, I don't think we're going to have an issue of this project getting completed. But you know, I completely agree. Safety is, you know, completed building. So, but
The only reason,
you know, I know Heath will finish the project.
Oh yeah.
yeah, the only reason why I brought up the possibility of helping with demolition is, number one, because the applicant was asking about it. And number two, because there is some value in bringing that building to the ground, even if something new isn't built there. At least it will be ready for someone to do something with it. But if the route you guys want to go is to structure our letter of commitment in such a way that no funds are dispersed until the building is completely done, then we can go that route. Is that the consensus?
I think so, yes.
Okay, very good. Number three, I think, is easier to answer. Would you like a statement from the applicant clarifying the relationship between these two entities, Heritage Construction and Heritage Investments?
Do you think we need one?
I think it's good just to kind of, you know, make sure we kind of check the box and there's no question there. So
I did look up Heritage Construction while you guys were talking, and I don't think there's any connection, but it's good to get something. I think they're out of Longview, and the guy's name isn't a stalk up that owns it, but
yeah, I'm
But-
sure it's perfectly fine, but it's, I mean, it's
Transparency and
Yeah.
sunshine, as Matt stated, that's
It-
a big
I
thing.
think it's-
So
Let's
I
get
think
it.
it's also
If it's not a
protecting
big
him,
deal,
too.
it shouldn't be hard to get.
yeah, I think it's protecting him as much as it is protecting us. So
Yeah, okay. Number four, how many construction bids shall be required?
I don't know what time it is.
Katie says 3.
I think we're required to have 3. So my bet, I'm thinking 3.
Okay,
It's
My-
3 in government, it's 3 in apartment management, it's 3.
okay. Yeah, we can go that route. I think that's fine. When I saw, Counselor Strobel says 3. When I saw the rough estimate bid, it struck me as quite low for what he's proposing, actually. So if they can do it for that price, that's fantastic. But I agree. Okay, we'll ask for 3 bids. Shall we require an operating pro forma and sources and uses table as I described? My strong recommendation is yes, for all of the reasons we were just talking about, sunlight and transparency. We've got to be able to justify to the taxing districts and anyone why we agreed to contribute the amount that we ultimately decide to contribute. Okay, looks like consensus
I'm on board
there.
with that. Yeah.
Yep.
Agree. Yep.
How involved do you want to be in the design?
I don't want to be a part of that. How does everybody feel? That's up to them.
Do we have a design committee or something like that in place already?
We have the design committee of the Downtown Estacada Commission, which will look at this project and score it to make sure it meets the code requirements. But that does not allow them to say, we don't like this this particular brick, or we don't like this window style that you've picked. They don't get into that level of nitty gritty. However, if you wanted to put something like that into a grant agreement that says we want to be able to give your final blessing to the design, I mean, the applicant might not be thrilled about that, but you're contributing a lot towards this and your name's going to be attached to it in some way. So
I think it would be a good idea to see a final design or something.
Well, technically, we already have it in our ordinance that they have to pick from a particular paint palette.
sure, yeah, color's one component. I mean, but they could, so I'll give you an example. They could propose to build something that's like timber frame aesthetic. That's like, or a Bavarian theme, or a modern contemporary architecture, and all of those designs could meet our design standards without an issue. But one of them, or maybe more or appropriate, or one of them may be completely inappropriate in your opinion for that, for downtown Estacada. That's kind of where you might want to exercise that ability. Just a thought. I'm not recommending it.
Yeah, I would think at least looking at the final design and getting some input if need be.
So they'd be your neighbor, Paul. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think anything's going to be an improvement over what's there now. So what Joel had suggested, just a final design review, is that within the scope of what we can do? At least then we'd have a say of hey, this looks great, or if it really stood out to us at that point, we'd say
yeah,
no.
I mean, you could really introduce any conditions you want into this letter of commitment. The more conditions you add, the more likely Heath is to say, forget you guys, I'll take my money elsewhere.
Yeah.
But reasonable conditions I think are worth entertaining. So if you want to reserve a veto power on the design, that's great, but we would want to have we'd want to give them some guidance on the front end so that they don't invest $50,000 in architecture only to have you guys get to the end and say, no, thank you.
So how do we go about something like that? I mean, this is way outside of my expertise.
Well, I can come up with some language for next meeting for you to look at, but it would just be a condition that says that you guys are going to have the ability to provide input in the preliminary design, and that you reserve the ability to, veto the final design. Or maybe you just want to say you want to provide input on the preliminary conceptual design if you feel comfortable that that's enough to guide it in the direction you want to see it go.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that wording too. Preliminary conceptual design. Yes.
All right, we'll work with that. I'll make it sound nice and flowery.
Matt, just let Heath know that we all understand that he's a longtime resident. He's been in this community for years and years and years, and we know that he's not going to do anything that's going to, look bad on Estacada. Just make sure he understands that point. We understand. We want downtown to look a certain way. We trust that he also wants downtown to look a certain way. But we just want to make sure that it, his idea and our idea are the same.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's sufficient guidance to keep us moving and to not scare off Heath. He knows we're going to be reasonable, and we know that he's going to be reasonable.
Yeah,
so
because I have no desire to pick out brick colors and things like that and window design. I'm more curious about the layout, how it's going to be and stuff, and that's kind of more what I'm looking at. So.
Okay. Anything else that is sticking out to you as important that we need to think about as we work with the applicant on putting together a final package for you to consider?
No, I think you covered pretty much all of it, Matt. You're pretty thorough that way.
And it's 10:15, right?
Yeah. It's a little
early.
Okay. I think that's enough guidance. I thank you for your time, and I'll get prepared for the next time we meet.
Thank you.
All right.
Good job, man.
All right, we're at that time of the meeting. So board member comments, any?
Thanks,
Everybody-
guys. Good night.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Good night.
Okay, we're
Yeah.
gonna adjourn this
It's
meeting.
been a
Sounds like
long
everybody's
night.
out of
Thank
here.
you, guys.
All right.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep, thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Does that mean it's adjourned?
It's adjourned, yeah.
Good night. Bye.